Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, 3 Monitoring Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. My name is Wayne Sung. I'm with the marketing team here in the Relic, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Speaking today, we have our very own Adam Larson, Principal Technical Marketing Engineer at New Relic. And before we get started, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar will be recorded and we'll send it to you within 24 hours so you can share with your broader team that couldn't attend today. And secondly, there will be a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please submit any questions that you might have in the GoToWebinar control panel. And lastly, there will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, so please take the time to give us your feedback. We always love to hear from you. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Adam to get us started. Thank you, Adam.
Hey, Wayne. Let me jump over, make sure I got control. Beautiful. So hi, as Wayne mentioned, my name is Adam Larson. I'm an engineer with New Relic. I've been with the company now for around 5 years. So I started off doing kind of core product development for the company, and then more recently I've been doing kind of direct work with customers and members of our sales field. So it's given me kind of a unique opportunity to see a lot of companies transitioning through kind of the more archaic, monolithic and on-prem software development cycle into the more modern, microservice and cloud and all the buzzwords that we know and love nowadays. And what I've kind of realized is there's a lot of just kind of commonalities that end up being kind of the first, I call them mistakes, but that's maybe a little bit harsh. Decisions that people make early on that end up kind of costing them down the road, and specifically those in regards to monitoring or something that I saw time and time again, and I'm like, if people just knew about these things, they could save themselves so much toil and make kind of the transition to more modern monitoring platforms so much easier. So I'm really happy that I can kind of take some time to present this to all of you. Before I get into any of that though, I just really want to quickly say thank you for taking the time. I know I sign up for a crazy amount of webinars and never actually attend them or watch the content. So the fact that you're here and watching this, whether live or recorded, is something that I take very seriously because I know there's a lot of things competing for your time. So that said, I'm going to try really hard not to commit the cardinal sin of webinars, which is automatically going off and just turning the whole thing into a big product pitch for New Relic. I try to make this so it's approachable kind of regardless of where you are in your monitoring journey. That said, let's jump into the kind of most common and first monitoring mistake that we see people making is, of course, not using the most comprehensive SaaS platform for monitoring that exists today, New Relic. Of course, this is a joke. Much to the dismay of my wife and her advice to not do it, I thought I'd start off with that, just kind of emphasizing again, this is not going to be a product pitch from New Relic, so I'm not going to show a lot of product screenshots. I'm not going to even be showing our solution too much. I'm going to be talking much more about concepts. When we get into the QA session though, I do highly encourage you, if you want to see what our solution would look like or how we'd solve some of these specific problems with more direct and technical kind of examples, I'd be super happy to go into that in detail at that point. All right, so with that, let's jump into the actual real content, and we'll start talking about the first monitoring mistake, which is not monitoring the entire system. And to explain what I mean by this, I want to start by telling you a story. So I don't know if all of you kind of intuitively know what this thing is, but this is the QNAP TVS 471 NAS. So network attached storage. This thing is 4 gig upgradable memory, quad-core i7 processor, 4 bay hot swappable drives. This thing is the Cadillac of network attached storage. If you were a teenager that was attracted to network attached storage, this would be the one that you'd have on a poster on your wall. And this is important to this conversation because this is something that I got really excited about. I'm super frivolous with my money, and I decided I want to buy one of these so I can just have it sitting on a shelf collecting dust. So I did my research and I kind of went around to a bunch of different websites. It was always out of stock, and then finally I got lucky and I found out that the thing was in stock on Amazon after months of waiting, and I got to order it, and then this process started. So I don't know if this is exactly how it works, but it's probably somewhat comparable to this. Is that the manufacturer went off and actually built this thing at some point. They did all their quality assurance and testing and soldered the boards and got the molds, and then they kind of created it, and then they handed it off to a distributor. In this case, Amazon. So Amazon then put it on the shelf. They did some marketing for it. They marked that it was in stock, and they made it accessible for me to purchase it. After that, kind of the next logical flow after I've ordered it is they hand it off to a third-party courier. And then the courier is then responsible for then just bringing it from the warehouse to my door. So they have this really cool app where I could actually see in real time where the package delivery was, and like I'm kind of tracking it obsessively. And then finally, you know, the status goes from like pending to delivered, and like I rush outside to my front door, and there's nothing there. You know, no package. So I'm you know, kind of worried more than anything. You know, I've spent this crazy amount of money on this thing. I'm invested. You know, I had a lot of kind of emotional connection to this purchase, and then you know, it just doesn't show up. So I call Amazon, and Amazon tells me like I have to go to the third-party courier, and the third-party courier tells me, hey, there's nothing we can do. You got to work with Amazon. So I just kind of get the runaround, and I do what any level-headed kind of non-entitled millennial would do in this situation, and I jump straight to Twitter, and I'm just like, you know, angry tweeting about the company and like, you know, this is ridiculous. How can you treat your customers like this? You know, it's like the product gets a 1-star review, so the manufacturer is taking a hit on this one, even though, you know, they really had nothing to do with it. But like without even seeing the product, you know, it's like I've already 1-star reviewed it because I'm upset that you know, via this website I ordered it and it didn't come. You know, social media galore. You know, I call my grandma back in Minnesota and I'm like, we're boycotting Amazon. You know, you're gonna buy your knickknacks from somewhere else or whatever it is that she purchases. And like, you know, I'm furious. And the kind of big takeaway from this is that like, you know, like Amazon really kind of did everything right in this case. You know, like they you know, got the thing from the manufacturer. Presumably it was vetted and they had some relationship with them. They handed it off to the courier, and the courier actually, you know, like didn't get it to our door. We found out later that they just had the wrong address, and that's why it didn't come. But the important takeaway here is that Amazon's brand like was the one that I purchased it from, and it was tarnished from a mistake that wasn't necessarily theirs. So bringing this back to something that's relevant to this crowd and kind of coming into reality here, I tell this story because I think that it's a really important kind of monitoring paradigm to look at your system in a comparable way. You know, like there's kind of the underlying infrastructure, which is kind of like, you know, like the warehouse to some extent, but like, you know, like that's where the servers and kind of all of the underlying hardware live. Then there's the back-end applications that run on top of those servers. Then there's the front end, the code that actually runs inside the browser. And ultimately, all of these different tiers are responsible for one goal of providing a user experience to a customer somewhere. There's somebody on the other end that's trying to accomplish something through all this technology. And I like telling the story because, again, like when you look at this kind of as an anecdote, you can see that like people are really good at monitoring their infrastructure. It's pretty easy to just throw a daemon process on a host, and like, you know, you get your CPU and your memory and your disk, and like, you know, it's a really familiar concept. People have been monitoring like, you know, hosts for years. People with, you know, kind of the growth of companies like New Relic like are getting more familiar with the notion of back-end monitoring. You know, it used to be just like parsing through log files and kind of you know, like setting up alerts and probes. But like, you know, the live instrumentation of your production systems running within your data centers are actually a pretty familiar concept. But there's not a lot of people that are actually doing a very good job of front-end monitoring. So we're actually like looking at like what is my browser performance? What is like, you know, like once the page gets to the customer, how long does it take for that page to actually render in the browser? Because there's, you know, code that's running there that's just as liable to fail as code that's running in the back end or the underlying machine to fail. And ultimately what that means is that they're not looking at the most important thing in this entire system, which is what does the customer experience actually look like? Because like there's tons of examples of like, you know, like my back-end application is responding in 5 milliseconds, but then my front-end application is taking, you know, like 20 seconds to render the page because I have really imperformant JavaScript. And like when you think about kind of how I thought about that package being delivered by Amazon, I don't really care that it's a courier problem, or I don't care if it's a manufacturer problem. Like I ordered something from Amazon, and Amazon was responsible for fulfilling that order. And I think that's very comparable to how a lot of customers think about web experiences. Like if I type Google into my browser and I click enter, I don't really care if there's a JavaScript exception or a backend, you know, like Java exception or like, you know, some underlying load balancer failed. At the end of the day, I ordered that website, and like the most important thing for that company should be, did the website make its way to my browser and provide the user experience that I cared about? So that's where I'm saying, you know, monitoring the entire system end to end such that you're actually validating the thing that matters rather than just kind of an arbitrary set of random metrics. And that segues into the second mistake, which is just focusing on arbitrary things about the system. So it's a little bit different in the monitoring the entire system because like you need to look at each of those tiers individually. But when you look at each of those tiers individually, there are things that matter, and there are things that maybe are related to things that matter, but probably aren't the things that matter themselves. So to again drive that home, I'm going to tell a really quick kind of a story. Like I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with the movie Speed. It was a 90s classic. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves are on a bus, and the kind of general premise of the entire movie is that this bus has a bomb on it, and the bus will explode if the bus goes below 50 miles per hour. So that kind of leads to vapid expression on Keanu Reeves' face, to scared Sandra Bullock, to speedometer. Keanu speedometer, Sandra speedometer, and like you keep going back to the speedometer. The whole movie is named Speed because it kind of makes everybody feel like the most important thing in the world is the speed of the bus. But when you think about it logically, there's plenty of buses that go below 50 miles per hour where it's not a problem. And even for this particular bus, it's maybe the bomb actually doesn't exist. Maybe they were just told that it was going to be there, but it's not real. Or maybe the accuracy by which the speed is tracked on the bus is actually not that great. So it's actually 55 miles per hour, 45 miles per hour that are going to be a problem. So it kind of gets you thinking that the most important metric is the speed of the bus, but that's actually not true. The most important metric in the system is, did the bus explode? So again, kind of tying that back to hopefully something that is more relevant to all of you, is like when we first end up engaging with customers, one of the first things that we generally get asked is, what does our host monitoring look like? And very specifically, like I pick on the CPU metric, but there's a lot of metrics that are in the same category. Like one of the first things that everybody comes up to us is like, hey, look, I got to know what my CPU is. Like I got to know like full stop. It's like where is my CPU at any given time? Because there's this notion kind of built up in especially kind of the old guard of ops folks that like CPU and memory and disk space are like the most important things in the world. But again, when you think about it logically, like no business is ever shut down because they ran a machine above 90% CPU. It's just not an important thing to an end user experience. So the metric of did the bus go above 90% actually isn't that important. Like when you think about it, for the cloud, you're paying based on consumption and size. So if you can run a machine at 90% steady state CPU and it doesn't have a lot of spikes and it doesn't actually impact anything, that's actually a win. You're saving money by optimizing your compute load to the machine and underlying hardware, and you're not paying for stuff that you're not using. The important thing in the system is my customer experience degraded in any meaningful way by that CPU spike? So CPU going above 90% causing your user experience to start having errors or to start slowing down. Those are real metrics that you care about. Like if customers are actually like having to wait longer for your page to load, that corresponds directly with you losing memory. A machine running hot, memory being consumed, as long as it's not impacting something from a customer perspective, you shouldn't be waking people up over it. It's not really that important in and of itself. It's only potentially a leading indicator for things that might be important. So that's something that I really highly encourage everybody on this call to kind of look at the things that you're monitoring and say, if this actually happens, is that a problem in itself? If this happened and no other metric shifted, would it actually be a real thing that I should care about? Or is there something else that I should probably be monitoring that might be caused by some other issue? Maybe your website will slow down because you have imperformant Java code that you've written, as opposed to just the CPU spiking. So what you care about is, did the website slow down? And then you want to track down why that happened as kind of a secondary metric. The third mistake that I'm going to call out here is making monitoring their problem, and they in this case is you. We see this kind of time and time again as we deal with customers, is that they come to us and they kind of generally they've already kind of made this decision and they've kind of rolled around in it for a while before they end up engaging with us. But people look at monitoring as this pretty simple problem. It's like, yeah, I can, write the whole system and I can create this user experience. So why wouldn't I just, take the time to kind of grab some additional metrics, dump them in some database, and then run reports over it every once in a while? It's a pretty straightforward thing to do. So one of the first things I like calling out when that generally comes up is, this is kind of meant to be more comedic than anything, but when you look at it, there is something to be said about, generally speaking, we don't have a lot of free time. And developers aren't just sitting around kind of twiddling their thumbs a lot, waiting for deadlines to kind of approach before they start working. Generally deadlines are actually created around how many resources do we have, what's our presumed velocity, and what do we think we can get done in the time that we have. And then they try to minimize that kind of time to market by saying, hey, look, here's what we're going to shoot for. We may miss it, we may slip, but we're going to optimize for getting the thing out there quickly. And like what that means is like, by taking on this kind of undifferentiated value of building a monitoring system, you're hurting your ability to deliver the differentiated business value that actually drives revenue for your business. Like if you're not a monitoring company like New Relic, like, it's like if this isn't your core business, the time that you're spending on a fairly commoditized problem is time that you're wasting not spending on whatever it is that your business is paid to do. So that's a really important concept. And then people generally, kind of like to respond to the how much time does it generally take? Like, I think there's this kind of misconception, again, if people kind of look at it and they say, yeah, I just got to grab some metrics. It's going to be a name and a timestamp, and like, I'll just plot that over time, and like I'll choose, 5 metrics that matter. I'll set up alerts on them, and Bob's my uncle. But the reality is that like modern monitoring, especially with modern systems, especially microservices and PaaS platforms, requires a lot of different types of monitoring. It's not so easy as just like, like numbers over time. Like there's log data, there's trace data, there's distributed traces through systems, there's metadata that you want to annotate so you can filter and facet the data that you're collecting. There's real-time inventory about what do you have deployed where. There's events and things, kind of like config changes. There's a lot of things that are happening that can impact those metrics. So just seeing like, hey, look, like the response time spiked up isn't helpful if you can't say why did that response time spike up and actually fix that issue. So there's a lot of different types of data to collect, generally with different types of data storage concerns and ingress concerns. But then once you've collected all this different type of data, there's kind of these core things that like, you actually have to make that data actionable. You have to be able to do something with it. So generating reports, creating alerts, like building up dashboarding technology, and like there's different point solutions out for each of these, and like they're not super hard, but like they start building up in terms of complexity. But now you have a pretty complex system that you're maintaining yourself. Like you have new software. And now you have to monitor the monitor. Like if the thing goes down, you need to know, like, did it go down? Why did it go down? So you can fix it. You need to actively develop on it as your requirements change over time. So like what looked like, you're just collecting a pretty simple set of metrics is now turned into a full-fledged software project that you're actively responsible for maintaining. And with any active software project, you have to worry about scaling it as your project grows. You have to worry about security concerns, patching it. You have to worry about upgrading it as hardware concerns and PaaS platforms kind of force those changes. On top of that, like you want to keep up with modern trends. Like what does serverless monitoring look like? Like, can you use the same data stores? Are there new requirements? Like there's third-party data coming through with Kubernetes and Istio, and like kind of like these open source tools that like are doing a pretty good job of some data collection that you just want to be able to pump into your system. So is your system purpose built for that, or now you have to like invest more engineering resources, kind of scaling to all those concerns so you can hit those kind of bullet points again, which are not differentiated value for your business. Those are all things that you're focusing on that are not actually driving revenue. They're just helping you deliver the software that hopefully is delivering revenue for your business. So all the time that you're spending on this is more or less wasted. And the one last thing that I like to kind of just emphasize when it comes to the scale of kind of this problem and taking it on yourself is there's kind of all these glamour metrics about what happens on the internet. So in 1 minute, there's 2,000 new, food blogs, I'd assume, published. There's 480,000 tweets, 1 million Tinder swipes, 3.7 million queries. This one I love. There's 100 on the entire internet in 1 minute. There's 187 million emails sent on average. So like that's just meant to kind of set a baseline, the banana for scale, if you will. And then the important kind of thing here is that New Relic processes 2 billion metrics in that same amount of time. So the type of data and the granularity that like these kind of more point solutions can provide to you rather than building it yourself is astronomical. Like the value that you're going to get from like delegating this problem to some other third party versus trying to build this yourself, and again not getting that differentiated value is pretty significant. With that, we're gonna kind of come to the 3 mistakes summary and hopefully give you some of your time back or jump into Q&A. So not monitoring the whole system. Obviously, the easy solution to that one is focus on monitoring the whole solution. Like you should be focusing on your browser as much as you're focusing on your backend applications, because a JavaScript exception can inhibit your user experience just as much as a backend Java exception can. And at the end of the day, your customers do not care where the errors are coming from. they're not going to forgive you for writing bad front-end code if it's inhibiting them from doing the same thing that like happened from one of the other issues. Mistake number 2, monitoring the arbitrary things about the system. Focus instead on monitoring the important things in your system. And like at the end of the day, that's really going to depend on you understanding your systems and like what is important to them. You know, oftentimes I like to break it down into the categorization of broken and slow. You know, it's like customers are not going to tolerate if a website comes back to them with just a white background and no indication of error, or like a 404 page, and they're not going to wait twiddling their thumbs while a page takes forever to load. So focus on at least those 2 metrics of like how long is it taking to respond and how often is it responding in an error form. And then from there you can derive, you know, it's like which specific transactions are important, you know, like your shopping cart checkout or your SaaS sign up flow or whatever it is that matters to your business. But spend time understanding what those things are and focus on those things and kind of ignore the dogma about like CPU and memory and all these kind of abstract concepts that may help you in debugging them, but are not the things that you should really be emphasizing your time and energy on. And then mistake number 3, you know, making monitoring the problem. I suggest make the monitoring the problem for someone else. And like I mentioned, you know, New Relic is a purpose-built solution for this. You know, I'd be happy through Q&A if anyone has specific examples that they want to see demonstrated to show that off. You know, you can always check out our page. We have a free trial. I highly encourage you to see, you know, because the value stands up on its own pretty quickly if you try the product out. I'm going to really quickly Billy Mays you because when I was preparing this, like I realized that there's kind of one more that I really wanted to go with, and in Billy Mays fashion, I'm going to wait, there's more. And I'm going to focus on like this last one, which we generally see, which is people coming to us when they kind of have thought about monitoring too late. And, you know, kind of like this is the analogy I always like using of like, this is kind of what modern software development looks like. You know, like the PMs lay out this really beautiful, lofty vision of like what it is that they're going to be delivering, you know, like this gorgeous meal. And then like, you know, it's like the trade-offs that you have to make, like where you have to sacrifice things and get it to market quickly. And like, you know, it's like you didn't quite understand the requirements and like all the business needs kind of come to front. And you kind of get this rushed big monolith. And this is true for every business that I've talked to. It's like their first incarnation, you know, is generally a pretty haphazard, like, you know, it's like just get the thing to market as quickly as we can. And I mean, like, I'm sure there's some edible stuff somewhere in there, but it's not very appetizing to the market, and it's a pretty tough pill to swallow when it comes to a maintenance story. And then there's the microservice rewrite, which, you know, it's like it creates some organization, but at the end of the day, you're still dealing with kind of a bunch of trash. And I like this analogy because generally this is the point where people come to us. They've started down the microservice path. They've started their cloud adoption. You know, they're trying to kind of rectify the concerns and issues that they've made, but they really don't have a kind of good sense as to like what their system actually looks like and what normal is and where things are broken. So I highly recommend that, like when you're starting off a new project, like especially in modern days, like where it's like the fail fast, learn fast mentality of like get the thing out there and then like it's gonna break and that's fine, but you have to be able to adapt to that break quickly. Like, you know, that really requires you being able to see what's going on in your system, and like you should be thinking about monitoring like as a first class entity in your project development. Like, you know, like I highly recommend that like if you're starting a project, like monitoring should be a checkbox before you go GA. If you don't know what that thing is going to look like in production and you're not going to be able to adapt to the concerns that you see, you're not going to be prepared to actually support that thing long term. And you're never going to be able to turn kind of this microservice rewrite into the next logical step, which is, you know, kind of like the rewrite or the compromise. And you can maybe even avoid this altogether if you just focus on like understanding kind of the smaller deltas of what went wrong as you're building the thing, rather than getting yourself into these kind of very deep rat holes. So with that, I again highly encourage you check out some of the content. You know, this is one particular place, the solutions cloud adoption, that basically show you how monitoring pertains to you know, like helping you in your cloud adoption story. And I'd be happy to elaborate on kind of why that matters. But I think this is really indicative of kind of like, you know, a good archetype of what monitoring from a new application perspective can look like in an ideal form. There's a lot of great content there. And then with that, finally, thank you. Please feel free to follow up with me directly. You can see my contact information here. I'd be super happy to field any questions either now or after the fact if you have them. Thanks again for attending.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam, for the really wonderful presentation and throwing in a bonus for our audience today. And I want to give everyone a few minutes to submit your questions if you haven't already. You may do so by doing it on the go to webinar control panel. And I have one feedback for you, Adam. It's great. Thank you for the good presentation. So really appreciate your time and telling our audience about the monitoring mistakes. So now let's go to the Q&A. What are some examples of metrics that you think are actually important in a system?
Yeah. So when it comes to monitoring, like I already kind of mentioned it, but like I really love emphasizing the broken and slow because I think that's pretty much true at all the tiers. Like at the end of the day, it's is it working is kind of like a fundamental question, and then it's is it responding in an adequate amount of time. So like what I think are like kind of the baseline metrics that you should be monitoring really at every tier, and especially if you can do it like from the customer perspective, is like how long does it take for my web page to become usable? So it's kind of like like time to glass and like actual like clickability of the interface. So that's response time, more or less is kind of the more common name there. And then like how often is the transaction resulting in an unhandled exception? Whether that's a JavaScript exception or a backend exception doesn't really matter. It's kind of those two core things I think are the most important things to focus on. Like from there, I think that it really depends on focusing on like what matters to your business. Like those are kind of baselines that I think are applicable to every business and like every application type. Is like like if you're writing code, that code can break or it can be slow. But from there, there's kind of sky's the limit depending on what's important to the individual. And like like looking at business metrics, it's like what percentage of my paying customers are experiencing something. Like like looking at like kind of things that are your facets, I think are really important as well.
Got it. We have one more. Could you elaborate on balancing the need to reduce cognitive workload during an IT incident and the overall customer focus on monitoring on the monitoring that you discussed?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, like, and like, I'm going to make a bunch of assumptions about what you mean. So feel free to follow up with another question if I miss it. But like when it comes to kind of like the whole DevOps movement as a whole, like what we've traditionally seen is like, like it used to be that there's a very clear brick wall. Like developers would write the code, and then like it's like they'd kind of have no idea what it would actually take to run in production. They just throw it over a wall, and there'd be like the whole IT and ops workforce that'd be responsible for maintaining that thing in production. And like DevOps has really been successful because like rather than treating those two disparate roles like they're dealing with different problems, we've kind of said like, hey, look, you're both responsible for the goal of delivering a customer experience to the end user. So what we've seen with that is that kind of like the IT and the ops roles have kind of like I would say maybe shrunk or been assimilated into. And maybe it's the dev role has kind of expanded, like however you want to look at it. But like at the end of the day, like it's like the only thing that should matter is the customer experience. And like it's like if the machine is again sitting at like 90% CPU and you've lost like four of your redundant machines, but no customers are impacted, like yes, it's important and you want to get that back up, but for the sheer sake of you want it to not impact your customer, not because those machines in and of themselves are that important. So everything should always be like regardless of your role or where you are, like revolving around the end user and the customer experience. So like trying to pivot the IT perspective to that as well, like where like it's like the things that they're doing are focused on the same sorts of metrics that the devs care about, and then they're working more collaboratively. Hopefully that hit your question. Again, please let me know if I made too many assumptions there.
Awesome. And another one. So what sort of things should I monitor on the front end in particular?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I already kind of said the broken and slow. Like my general rule of thumb, if I'm working with a new customer, is the first thing that you should do is you should set up what we call a synthetic monitor. And like there's a lot of different variants of this, but essentially what you want is you want something that's emulating a customer, like truly end to end. So it's like using a headless Chrome instance and actually like clicking on the UI, going to a web page, filling out a form, and like it's like trying to accomplish the same goal that the customer is, because that's your baseline. Like at the end of the day, like it doesn't matter how fast your backend services are or how redundant, like your underlying infrastructure is or how like great your deployment story is. If like all of that is like leading to your customer not being able to accomplish that core goal. So I would say that like setting up what we call synthetic scripts that like are actually logging in and emulating a customer like is the first thing that you should do. And what you should care about that again is how long is it taking to accomplish that end-to-end goal, like like from because that's going to be your happy path optimal sequence through it. And then how often is that like kind of thing failing? And the other big thing that you get from looking at the front end, and especially looking at it from a synthetic perspective, as like like actually emulating your customers, is that like if you're only waiting for things to go wrong and waiting for alerts on the system, that means that your customers have already been impacted. So you've kind of waited too long at that point, and you've already lost business, or you've lost brand cachet with at least one person. And like it's like that's unfortunate because like by being more proactive with your monitoring and looking at your front end through that kind of lens of like let me just continually try to emulate my customer gives you the ability to create those issues before your customers do. So hopefully you don't have to kind of pay that brand cachet debt in having that actually hit a real customer.
Perfect. I don't see any more questions coming in. So that will wrap up our webinar and we'll give everyone some time back. So before you leave, please take a moment to complete the survey. We'd love to hear from you what you like, what you don't like, and we can improve on future webinars. And thank you once again, Adam, for sharing your insights and expertise. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. We will send out the deck and the slides, the recording tomorrow morning. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you so much once again. Goodbye.